Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. It's great to be in this amazing hall. Thanks to Columbia University and the Sabin Center for setting this up and getting us this space. Thank you all for being here. We're excited about the event today, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the flow. But first, I'm Brad Ack. I'm the Executive Director, CEO of Ocean Visions, and we've been working on this topic for a little while here. And I just want to focus on the title for a moment of this talk, or this panel. Real solutions or expensive distractions. So I got a lot of pushback on this title. And I didn't come up with the idea of expensive distractions, right? This is what people say about anything that's not working on emission reduction. And it's a valid point. All right, we know that we've got to zero out emissions as quickly as possible. We've been working on that for 30 years. For many people, anything else that we do is an expensive distraction. However, there's a lot of us that believe that carbon removal is absolutely an imperative. It's not negotiable. And by a lot of us, I also include the IPCC and the UNFCCC, which has made it extremely clear that carbon removal is not negotiable. So the question is whether there are real solutions to be had here. So for the last few years, this field of ocean-based CDR has really been growing in energy and enthusiasm and engagement, and we're going to hear about a lot of that today. But we are not anywhere near the point of making societal decisions about deployment or not of these technologies at a climate relevant scale. And I think that's the critical part. Climate relevant means gigaton scale. And this is true for other CDR methods as well. I heard Bill Gates yesterday say that trillion trees was an absolute myth, that it would never solve climate, right? So there's debate about all of the other solutions that people are putting money into as well. But what we want to talk about is how do we get to the point of actionable information in 5 to 7 years. Let's give ourselves a target. It's a long time by my standards. I want to move much quicker, but I also recognize that there are some really fundamental and large things that have to happen to get to that answer. So this is all about moving beyond opinion. We've all heard a lot of opinions about whether these technologies can work or not work, but we are operating in a void of fundamental science answering those questions at scale tests. So that's what we're trying to do. So quickly, Ocean Visions, just to introduce our organization, we're a very small organization, but a network of science, technology, and innovation partners. And we spend a lot of time working to try to identify and accelerate solutions to some of the most critical problems facing the oceans. So why are ocean people even talking about CDR? I mean, that's a good question. Why aren't we having a panel on plastics and fisheries and marine habitat loss? Well, the main reason is because of our spiking greenhouse gas concentrations, right? And we all know this chart and we know these graphs, but over the last couple of hundred years, we have had this massive departure in atmospheric concentrations of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide that are warming the planet, warming the ocean. But what sometimes we lose sight of is that now we are wildly out of bounds with the historical record. So over the last 800,000 years, carbon has sort of cycled by about 80 parts per million in and out of glacial ages. And now we are about 120 parts per million above that, maybe even more. So we're around 424 now. So we're on this massive experiment with the Earth system with an enormous amount of excess carbon that we have really no good historical record to understand what that's going to do. And we know that it's driving enormous change in the ocean, right? So one of the, I would argue, the biggest stress to the ocean ecosystem, bar none, is thermal. It's pollution, thermal pollution. The amount of heat that we're driving into the ocean has raised overall ocean temperatures by measurable amounts and has been quantified in terms of the Hiroshima bomb equivalence of heat energy going into the ocean, which is now at around 7 per second. So that's how much heat we're driving to the ocean, heating this entire system. You can see from the colors that it's a differential. It's much, much warmer in certain parts of the ocean. The one cool spot there is south of Greenland, which is due to all of the melt coming off of the Greenland ice sheet, which is actually cooling that part of the ocean. But this is having a whole series of effects, right? Causing sea level rise. Warmer water expands. Warmer water holds less oxygen. We have these marine heat waves like we saw this summer in an amazingly large scale across the Atlantic, which is also, of course, causing coral bleaching. This is interrupting the very mixing and fundamental nutrient exchange between upper layers and mid layers of the ocean. We're seeing much more powerful storms, increased melt of sea ice and ice sheets because of the warming waters around where the sea ice is lost, and poleward migration of species. So the climate crisis is clearly an ocean crisis, right? And when we sort of blithely say the ocean has absorbed 93% of the heat and move on, we should not do that. We should say the ocean has taken the body blows, the massive body blows and the injuries of all this trapped heat for the planet. But it can't keep doing it. There are limits to how much we can keep pouring heat into the ocean without suffering enormous feedback loops, and we're already seeing some of those. The second big stress is chemical. We're putting about 26% of all the CO2 that's been emitted through anthropogenic sources has absorbed into the upper layer of the ocean, which is changed ocean chemistry across this entire 71% of our planet's surface, but much more in terms of the depth. We've changed the ocean chemistry to about 30% increase in acidity, which obviously has big impacts on any forms of life that form shells, and it's a giant uncontrolled chemical experiment in the ocean. So this is why ocean people are at Climate Week talking about CDR, because yes, we have to stop increasing the problem, but we're already at levels that are unacceptable, really, from the standpoint of being responsible citizens and members of this planet, right? We need to bring these things back down. We need to try to reverse these. So is the emission reduction agenda working? Well, this is the latest statistical review of world energy, and the bad news, greenhouse gas levels record in 2022. Renewable share of primary energy, if you take away hydroelectric, 7%. So yes, we are making progress, but it's far too slow, and it might accelerate, and we hope it will accelerate, but we need Plan B as well. And especially when you look at the fact that we're still investing in fossil fuel infrastructure at just a hand over fist rate, right? And some of you probably saw the demonstrations outside Bank of America this week and other places. 5.4 trillion in new fossil fuel investment since Paris, and that doesn't count all the existing fossil fuel subsidies as well. So putting all our chips on emission reduction is probably not being the most wise steward of our actions. We need to think about some other things. So we believe we need what we call a 3R agenda. The first is reduce, which is what we're all talking about. How do we stop these emissions? But the second is removal, and the third is repair. There's likely a chance that these activities won't arrive in time to forestall or stop dangerous tipping points, and we're also going to have to be thinking about how we intervene to buy time. That's not the topic for today. So cleaning up carbon pollution, again, I mentioned the IPCC has made it exceedingly clear that this has to happen in the 1.5 report, and then again in AR6. They talked about carbon removal on the scale of 100 to 1,000 gigatons over the course of this century, the next 70 years, in order to have a chance of 1.5. This was before we sort of were at the level where we know we're likely to exceed 1.5 in the next couple of decades. So these numbers might even be low. But if we want to ever come back from 1.5 and beyond, we are absolutely going to need a lot of carbon removal, right? And 1.5 isn't some bright line of safety. We are already seeing very dangerous and severe impacts across the globe. We're seeing all sorts of reports of the possibilities of exceeding tipping points, of many, many, many millions of people being displaced at current levels of CO2. So the only way back from this is CDR. Emission reduction stops the continued injury, and CDR is the only thing that heals ultimately or returns the system back to some level that might be stable. So that's why we talk about it. So how are we doing on CDR? Well, there was a report issued, I think this was the first edition, a global scientific assessment of CDR, which found that we're currently averaging about 2 billion tons, so 2 gigatons of CO2 each year, but it's almost entirely through quote unquote conventional approaches, and only a tiny fraction of that is from what they called novel approaches. And if you can read these slides, which I haven't looked behind me, novel approaches didn't even include the ocean. And this is a quote from the report that says, the next decade is crucial here for novel CDR. Failure to create momentum in this phase will mean that we'll have a widening gap that we can't fill. So basically, we have to create the conditions for exponential growth to happen sometime, at the end of this decade. And that's going to require rapid growth of novel CDR, which is exactly what we're here to talk about, ocean-based CDR. So why do we believe the ocean is one of the places to look? Well, first, because it is already the planet's natural cycler of carbon through the biological pump and through chemical processes like enhanced rock weathering. And there is about 50 times more carbon in the bottom of the sea than there is in the atmosphere. And if you look at where we could possibly store carbon and what natural processes and nature-inspired processes we might use to remove and store carbon, you have to think about the ocean. It's just obvious. So that's why we're here talking about this. Again, there are both biological and chemical approaches, and probably many are still yet to be refined and iterated upon and invented, but we're going to hear about some of them today. But you have biological approaches like the use of macroalgae and microalgae, the natural biological pump of the ocean, and then chemical processes like alkalinity enhancement, and a variety of iterations upon those two. Ocean Vision's led a series of roadmaps around each one of these technology domains, and you can find this on our website, and it will go into a lot of detail about what we know and what we don't know about these technologies. But now we're at the point where we believe we need a higher level roadmap. And that's what we're here to talk about today. We have to have actionable information to determine whether these technologies can be deployed at a climate relevant scale, 5 to 7 years. So what do we need to do that? There's a bunch of science, and you're going to hear about that today, but controlled field trials across every pathway is fundamental. You cannot answer these questions without doing work in the water. Monitoring, reporting, and verification technologies and systems that are able to ascertain what's happening and the durability, additionality, safety is absolutely critical, and that's a bunch of science as well. And then, we're going to need social science also, and we're going to hear about that today. Technology optimization, we are still very low on the technology readiness levels of some of these, even though they're being tested. There's ample room for improvement of many, and almost all the startups in the space are iterating and optimizing, but we need to bring in other disciplines. We need AI, we need synthetic biology, we need robotics, nanotechnology, whatever it might be. We need to bring a lot of brains into the room to help optimize, think about what it's going to take to go to scale, think about all the co-products and the economics of these approaches, because that will be critical to whether they actually work. And then lastly, none of this happens without enabling policy and regulatory frameworks, which are critical. They have to happen in conjunction because all of these things operate in an interconnected way. So that is, and then lastly, how much is it going to cost? And we've got the report from the National Academies, which had a price tag of around $1.4 billion to get this done in a few years. We had a previous report from the Energy Futures Initiative, which had a $2.1 billion price tag. And I'm really happy to say a bill dropped just this week by Senators Tonko and Schatz, the Carbon Dioxide Removal Research and Development Act, $12 billion. So now we're starting to get into the ballpark of what's going to be needed. It's not going to be inexpensive to do the kind of work that has to be done to prove this out. But if there is a promise of potentially gigaton scale carbon removal, this is a very low price to pay. So with that, I am really excited to be joined by an esteemed group of panelists who are all going to talk about different parts of that last map that we saw. So we're going to have discussions on field trials, on monitoring and verification, on policy and enabling frameworks, on social science, and on the role of government. And the order that you see on the screen is the order that we are going to have our speaker. So I'm delighted first to introduce Dr. Antonius Gagern, who I've been working with now for some time. He is the executive director of the Carbon to Sea initiative, which is a great initiative on ocean alkalinity enhancement and trying to answer many of the questions that we've posed. He was previously with CEA, where he led many of the early investments into this space and is, I would say, responsible in a significant measure for this conversation even happening. So delighted to have you, and please.
Hi, good morning, and thanks, Brad, and thanks, Romany, for having me here. Really the one role that I have today is to repeat one of the things that Brad said during his talk, which is if we want to find out if ocean-based CDR is a good idea, we have to do the research. And part of the research involves testing it in the water, in the real world. And that is really, really difficult at this point. And we have to work together on many, many levels to achieve that. So the premise of this conversation, again, is that the ocean has the potential to remove excess CO2 from the atmosphere and dial down the global radiator of the planet. And so the question here is that safe? Is that cost effective? Is that scalable? And to find out, we created the Carbon to Sea initiative a couple of years ago, which is a nonprofit, science-first initiative to answer these questions. We're supported by some of the most experienced funders in the climate-ocean intersection, and we're delivering consensus on these questions via 5 pillars of work: science, technology, field research, networks, policy, and community building. I won't go into detail on these, but they are all one interrelated set of work streams. Now, I really want to focus on the need for field research in the coming years. The natural progression of observational science on ocean CDR is from lab to mesocosm to field trials. In lab and mesocosm studies, you can isolate questions in highly controlled settings. You can go parameter by parameter. As you're moving to mesocosms, you will try to understand if the findings in the lab are robust in less controlled settings that are closer to reality. But really, the field research is where you're confronting your hypotheses in a highly complex system. And there's no way to imitate the complexity of the real world in lab and mesocosm settings. Now, lab work and mesocosm work is well underway in this field right now. But field research is a slow, costly, grinding process. And there are many reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons is permitting. Other reasons include just, the cost of doing research in the field is just orders of magnitudes more than doing the same work in the lab. In order to do work in the field, this has to be informed by modeling work to design that research. It has to include sensor technologies to understand what you're learning, because you cannot just take a sample like you do in the lab and analyze the carbonate chemistry there, and then it just has to be it's just much more costly. So in order to help out with that, what we're doing in our program is to try and provide the easy button for the research and startup community to do hypothesis-based testing of the most important questions, while at the same time creating the data that society needs to make decisions on whether this is desirable or not. And so we're doing that through a global network of R&D hubs, and at the moment looking at 5 different regions in the world. That has resulted from a bit of an initial scoping exercise. We wanted to find places that are relatively calm sheltered basins, not too deep, no zoning conflicts, no sensitive habitats, somewhere close to major airports. So we just wanted to find research. We wanted to find bays and ocean areas where this research can be done realistically without spending too much money. And so the current sites under consideration include Iceland, Canary Islands, Halifax, Bahamas, and Bermuda. You'll see that the US is not on that list. Part of that reason is just because permitting is not at a point where we see a clear path to getting these field research sites up and running within a couple of years, which is the ambition. But I would very much like for this to change. Just really quickly to say what it takes to create an environment where this research can happen in the real world is we first have to understand the research relevance of the different sites, both on physical and biogeochemical characterization. As a next step, incredibly important in this field, which is so new and so unexplored, a community engagement process is just absolutely indispensable to understand the conditions under which local communities are supportive of this kind of research. The permitting and permitting frameworks then is one of the biggest hurdles, which I think Romany will talk about a little bit. And then ultimately creating these R&D hubs where we want to have the logistical support and the permitting in place, and laboratory infrastructure to allow researchers to do this work without shipping around containers full of material each time. That then requires real R&D investment. And so that's kind of the big picture here. Again, just to sum up all this is we're at a point where the National Academies of Science has created a consensus report that stipulates the real potential of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal to contribute to solving the climate challenges we're facing. And we have to find out if those are viable approaches, and the only way to do so is through field research at a massive scale. And so that goes through phases of work, but the really important thing is this is not one field trial that you have to do. It is many, many, many field trials in different parts of the world, testing different types of approaches to little by little create the empirical evidence that we need to make the right decisions. And so let's get to it.
Thank you, Antonius. So one of the components of this high-level map is field trials, controlled field trials. I think Antonius laid out a very strong overview of what that is going to take. It's probably going to be the single biggest part. But also, really important, excuse me, is the monitoring, reporting, and verification. How are we going to know whether this works, whether the carbon is additional, durable, safe? And so I'm really happy to have Peter Menocal, who is the director of the Hole Oceanographic Institute, here with us to talk a little bit more about that. Peter is a marine geologist and paleoclimatologist. And before he joined WHOI a few years back, he actually was at Columbia for a long time and led a number of things, but one that struck me was the Center for Climate and Life, a climate solutions research accelerator. So Peter's been focused on solutions for a long time, and we're really pleased to have him with us, so thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Brad and Romany, for the kind invitation to join. I've had something like 22 meetings over the past week, and this is the one I've been looking forward to the most. Let me get through. I just have one thing I'd like to ask you all to remember for today, and that is whenever you hear marine carbon dioxide removal or MCDR, I want you all to think MRV. That is, every time you hear of a solution or hear of something that can be done at scale or could be a real solution, we first have to get our head around how we're going to do exactly as Brad mentioned. How are we going to monitor it, report, verify? Just to give you an idea or an appreciation for the scale of the challenge ahead of us, some of you may be familiar with this facility in Iceland, built by Climeworks. It pulls out about 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. It's fantastic, it's great, we need more of these, but if you scale that with respect to current emissions, this is a wonderful approach that David Ho brought to life. This instrument or this facility brings up about 3 seconds of our emissions per year. Then if you imagine you want to plant 100 million trees, that's a number of companies have come forward with that initiative. Sounds great, need more of it, but that represents about a half an hour. So when you start looking at ocean-based solutions, as we've heard this morning, ocean-based solutions really, truly have the potential to scale. The oceans already take up 25% of our emissions, and if you just do the math, it's about 3 months of carbon removal, just by virtue of us having an ocean. The ocean is not being asked to do anything, it's just through Henry's law that the ocean takes up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to the ocean through equilibration. But the ocean has the potential to do much more, as we've heard. Just for scale, if you could take all the excess carbon emissions that are in the atmosphere, the entire thing that we're concerned about regarding climate change, if you could gather it all and mix it into the ocean like a martini, it's about a 1% addition to the ocean's carbon reservoir. So we're not the only ones to know this. Venture funds are flowing into MCDR. Some of you are representing these institutions here today. These consist in broad categories as seaweed cultivation, enhanced weathering, and electrochemical changes to drive alkalinity and pull carbon dioxide out of the ocean. The point being is that there's a lot of venture funds that are running into this, and many of those are represented in the room tonight or today. And I think every one of you is probably asking the question, how are we going to afford the very expensive MRV that's going to document whether our technology works? Because we know it works, it's just that we have to prove it in the ocean and prove it does no harm. That's hard. And I just take this quote here from Peter Drucker. Some of you all have known this, but really all I've been hearing all week has to do with managing certain aspects of the ocean. And in particular regard to MCDR, you can't manage what you don't measure, and that's where I'd like to pivot to now. Today we have a very good understanding of ocean temperature throughout the world's oceans, in particular how they're changing month to month, year to year, And these nearly 4,000 Argo floats are moving up and down in the water column down to 2 kilometers, and they rise again. They measure temperature and salinity, mostly, and pressure. And when they surface, they phone home, download their data, clear their buffers, go back down and do the measurements over and over again, floating passively around the sea. They're about as smart as your toaster, but they do a great job. And consequently, we know if you go from 0 to 2 kilometers water depth, that's the y-axis, and then it's time from 2004 to actually just last month. I had the team update this. This is the temperature anomaly in the upper ocean, upper 2 kilometers. And you can see just the tremendous warming, not only in the surface, but now it's extended below the surface, below the level of our observations, below 2 kilometers. So we have a very good idea of where the warming is in the global ocean, how specific areas are changing over time. We can map temperature in the ocean pretty darn well by virtue of this. But then when you ask the question, can we do the same thing for carbon, we're flying blind. We have very few observations of ocean carbon, both on the surface, but in particular below the surface. And it's below the surface where MCDR makes any difference. It's, we really need to be able to access, certainly below the skin of the ocean, but getting down to the depths of the ocean is where you can access those volumes. So what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of my time here is really getting our community around this idea of embracing a new era of ocean observing. What we're envisioning at the Woods Hole Oceanographic, but really this is in partnership with institutions around the world, is an ocean internet of sensors. I was describing it to someone in a party. Sometimes you get your best insight at a party. And somebody says, oh, so it's like Starlink. And it's like, yeah. You mean it's like an upside down Starlink, a sea Starlink? And they were going on and on. So we coming up with branding right on the spot. But the idea is that this is an always on, always connected, intelligent sampling, basically using our skills in machine learning and AI to really drive intentional sampling of the ocean, to really focus, a laser focus on ocean carbon and tracking ocean health and the parameters attached to that. Now, it may sound like a pie-in-the-sky dream, but actually all these technologies exist. Certainly they exist at the Oceanographic, and they exist in companies and institutions around the world. To build an ocean internet, think of what you have in your home. You've got a plug to plug in your router, and then you've got a Wi-Fi, you've got a Wi-Fi extender, then you've got your phones that connect to it, you've got your toaster that connects to it, you've got this ocean, this internet of things. Well, we can do the same thing in the ocean, except the ocean is salty and therefore conductive, and therefore you can't use electromagnetic radiation like we can above the ocean. We have to use something else, like acoustics or lasers. This is all work that we currently do. So for example, docking in data, we can send a vehicle out for a 2-week mission using inertial navigation. It can sample intelligently any volume in the ocean. When it docks, it can download its data, and that can be uploaded to the buoy and up to either Starlink or a 5G satellite system. We can also, as it docks, it can repower. It dumps its data, uses induction just like your iWatch, and repowers. We can connect directly to the satellite network, and then we now have intelligent sampling of the oceans and swarming. So Brad can be a robot next to me, and I can say, Brad, I couldn't measure this ISO line of pH. Can you go back to this location and continue the measurement? And it can actually measure it intelligently. So when we envision what this might look like, we're not going to boil the ocean with this. The idea is not to launch it everywhere all the time. That obviously is a massive expense. But to really get to this point that Antonius was mentioning, and actually Brad as well, that we focus on trying to solve the problem at hand, a laser focus on what's the MRV requirement that's required to document and close the carbon budget locally, but as well really dramatically reducing the uncertainties that go into not only those budgets, but also that then inform the modeling community to improve their modeling of subsurface processes. So this is a cartoon that's dated now. It's about a year old, but if you imagine green being, in this case, induced algal growth in the ocean, on the right-hand side is the classic biologic pump. a sort of state estimate for the current ocean, and then on the right would be an enhanced biologic pump, let's say through iron fertilization. How would we ever quantify this? And this is what we're really trying to solve, is how you would go about doing an intentional experiment, closing the carbon budget locally or at least regionally, and really trying to solve the problem. So this is just one example of a tracer release in silico. It was done on a computer. This is for about a 150 kilometer square box in the South Atlantic. In this case, it's comparing a single release versus a continuous release on the surface of the ocean. The point here being, imagine having to trace this complex flow in the ocean using Argo, or using ships, or using any of our standard vanilla assets. We really need to think about this differently. In terms of quantifying ocean storage, a big part of this is really understanding what the baseline is, that gray bar here. This could be an export flux. And then in an intentional experiment, in this case, iron fertilization. And then integrating under that curve and saying, that's the carbon stored. And also assessing ecosystem impacts along the way. So how are we going to do this? It's really through partnerships. It's not just the Woods Hole Oceanographic. The federal agencies have been tremendously creative in driving new funding into this field. We've developed industry partnerships. We've actually established a hybrid venture fund called Propeller that actually is helping us support some of this work. Philanthropy is massively important. It provides that catalytic risk capital early on that lets us actually even dream the dream of doing this. And lastly, I'll just say that it really comes down to research partners. That is, we're not doing this alone. This is bigger than any one institution. And really what we found is this coordination, not only nationally but internationally, around building the sensors, the technologies, the vehicles, and coordinating with the modeling community, in particular, seaworthy. So just some observations, maybe recommendations even. Is this a chance to co-develop marine measurement reporting and verification with MCDR, that we have to do this together, we have to be married together. Having a laser focus on what we're trying to solve, not trying to boil the ocean, but really trying to focus on what we need to do to prove or disprove. This has to be led by science, by independent scientists. If this is being led by industry, particularly the industries that are trying to make a difference in this or trying to profit from this, we're not going to get what we need and what we want. And then lastly, I think this dials into the role of MRV in establishing a code of conduct that we all live by as we pursue this important work. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Peter. That was great. And it just exemplifies how complex this is, but yet how critically important it is. And I think laser focus is a really important message to retain. We're now going to shift a little from the science of that of the high-level roadmap to the policy and regulatory framework, which, as we all know, and Antonius highlighted very clearly, we can't do any of this without that. And so really excited to have Romany Webb, who has been leading a lot of the work in this space around legal and regulatory frameworks. She was on the NASAM Academy panel and that produced the Ocean CDR report and the research agenda. And she also, with colleagues, co-authored this model federal law for ocean-based CDR research and development. She's the deputy director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, and she's an adjunct at the Climate School as well, and the research scholar at the Columbia Law School, and co-host this morning. So thank you, Romany.
Thank you, Brad. All right. Well, thanks, Brad, and hi, everyone. As Brad said, my name is Romany Webb. I am based at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. We are really pleased to be co-hosting this event today together with Ocean Visions, and I want to take this opportunity to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Isabel Teniedo, who's over there, who has just done a massive amount of work to make sure everything goes smoothly today. So thank you for that, Isabel. Some of you, maybe not after these talks, but often when I come to panels like this, people ask me, why is the Sabin Center, an academic institute that is focused on climate change law, working so much in the ocean CDR space? Isn't that just a scientific issue or a scientific endeavor? And we've heard from these great scientists over here about the many scientific questions that need to be answered and the huge amount of scientific work that needs to be done to answer them. But as you'll hear from this side of the table, there's a lot of non-scientific factors that are going to have a huge impact on our ability to do that work and answer those questions. And one of them is legal factors. So it's really important that we have a legal framework that facilitates and enables the research that we need in this space to answer these questions, but at the same time, also ensures that research occurs in a safe and responsible way. There are risks associated with these activities, and so we need a legal and governance framework that effectively recognizes, mitigates, and manages those risks. And I would argue that currently we don't have that. So legal reform is going to be really important to actually make any progress around ocean CDR. So the Sabin Center recently published a series of white papers that look at how existing legal frameworks at the international level and domestically in the US apply to different ocean CDR techniques. You can see the covers up there. And sort of the common finding across all of these reports is that currently there's no comprehensive legal framework specifically designed for ocean CDR. But there are lots of general environmental and other laws that might apply to or have implications for ocean CDR projects. Those general laws were designed with other activities in mind. They date from, in the US, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, before ocean CDR was on anyone's radar. And so there's often a lot of uncertainty and complexity around their application to ocean CDR. And that's a problem for a few reasons. We found that in some cases, existing legal frameworks may be overly strict and may inappropriately or unnecessarily hinder ocean CDR research. So some ocean CDR research projects might be subject to multiple overlapping or duplicative permit requirements that can be really difficult for developers to navigate. Developers may need to get approvals from multiple agencies in the US at the federal, state, tribal, and local levels. It's a very complex, time-consuming, and costly process that can really hinder and sometimes even prevent projects moving forward. At the same time, on the other hand, we've also identified some key gaps and shortcomings in existing legal frameworks that mean that they might not adequately address the unique risks posed by ocean CDR, and they could, for example, create opportunities for rogue actors to pursue projects that are not scientifically sound or that present undue risks. And if that happens, it can have a really major impact on public perceptions of these activities and affect sort of issues around social license. We're already seeing that play out in other sectors, particularly in some of the recent debates around solar radiation management that some of you might have seen covered in the press. So what's the solution to these problems? One option would be for Congress to enact new legislation to create a dedicated legal framework specifically for ocean CDR. And Brad mentioned that last year, with the support of Ocean Visions, we embarked on a project to think about what that legal framework should look like. And in March, we published this model federal legislation. It's basically a draft bill that could be considered by Congress. The overarching goal here was to replace this current sort of patchwork of general laws that apply to ocean CDR with something that's specifically designed for it. So as part of the process of developing the model law, we thought about how might we clarify and, where appropriate, streamline permitting requirements. But how do we still make sure that there's effective oversight of projects, that there's effective identification, management, and mitigation of risks, and that there's effective community engagement. And so this graphic sort of summarizes what we came up with. It is many of the scientists in this room, I can hear chuckling because it is, as you would expect from a team of lawyers, very complex. But I'll just quickly break it down for you. So one of the key things that the model legislation does is to say that a single federal agency should be in charge of overseeing ocean CDR research projects. That lead agency, as we call them, would be responsible for, among other things, permitting field trials, so in-ocean research projects. And so no longer would a researcher have to go to multiple agencies at different levels of government to get the approvals they need. There's a one-stop shop. We recognize, though, that that single federal agency that's reviewing and approving these projects, it's going to need to draw on the experience and the expertise of others. There are a lot of different bodies, both within and outside government, that have expertise and experience that's relevant to these decisions, and so we want to make sure that they're appropriately involved and included. We seek to do that in a few different ways. So one way is by creating what you see at the top, a new interagency working group on ocean CDR research. That group would be responsible for, among other things, developing a national research plan for ocean CDR. So an overarching plan for guiding what happens in the space. That plan could then go to regional bodies that would think about how to operationalize it on a regional level, taking into account the baseline environmental conditions, the other ocean users, where should we be doing this research in the Northeast or in the Gulf, et cetera. And then that work would feed into the decisions that the lead agency makes around individual projects, when they should be permitted, where, how, et cetera. Now, this is just one potential approach, and when we published this, we really hoped that it would be the start of a conversation. People may come up with something better, but the idea here is to highlight the need for legal reform in this space and to start thinking about what that might look like. And this is one option. We all know, I'm sure, how difficult it is to get new legislation enacted at the federal level at the moment. So it's important, I think, to recognize that there are other options for advancing the ball in this space. So we may see action by the federal executive under existing law to do things like promote greater interagency coordination, to streamline permitting, to simplify environmental review and other requirements. There's also lots of opportunities at the state and local levels for legal reform. So you see on this slide a paper that we published last year that looked specifically at some of the issues around seaweed, permitting of seaweed cultivation for CDR in California, and the actions that could be taken by that state to improve the situation. There's also opportunities to engage with and work with Native American communities and tribes to co-develop projects. And then there's also some, what I would describe as sort of soft or internal governance options in this space. So, for example, codes of conduct or ethical frameworks for advancing this sort of activity that can help provide some guardrails around what does and does not happen and fill some of those gaps that we see in the legal framework currently. I think that's all I had, so I'll leave it there. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, Romany. So if we've heard about the complexities of the science, of the monitoring, and of the legal framework, but maybe there's nothing more complex than all of the social issues around these questions. It gets very charged, and psychology and mindset is a big part of the challenge that we also have to face here, which is why we called this, why the title had expensive distractions, because that's clearly part of what the mindset is. So here to help illuminate some of what needs to happen in terms of the social science research, engagement, and advance is Sara Nawaz. Sara Kapnick is next after that. Sara is the Director of Research at American University's Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. They're going to be having a big conference coming up here soon on these topics. She's an environmental social scientist who studies how CDR policies and technologies might be designed and implemented in just, equitable, and responsible ways. So Sara, please.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much, Brad, for the introduction, and Romany as well for the invitation. My name is Sara Nawaz. I am going to talk today about a few not super comprehensive, but I think a few key ideas for what we really need to focus on to ensure that we are moving in a sort of more effective and responsible direction as we try to scale up ocean-based carbon removal, and particularly focusing on the social science piece, as Brad mentioned. So just, yeah, a bit about me that Brad's already covered, but I'm an environmental social scientist, and a lot of my work focuses on kind of how we make decisions as a society around novel, emerging, often controversial environmental and climate technologies. And I think, yeah, it's worth beginning with just chatting a bit about why social science is necessary, and I think about this as a few key reasons. The first is that people have very diverse and often deeply held values about ocean spaces and also emerging technologies of this kind. And as the ocean is a global commons, we really have an ethical obligation to make sure we're including and incorporating these values and views in designing these technologies and scaling them up, seeing if we should scale them up, et cetera. Oops. This has already come up in this morning, but we're talking about a diversity of different possible impacts. These could vary depending on the type of technology, pathway being applied, the specific technical dimensions of each of those pathways, things like what materials you're using, where you're sourcing them from, and so forth. There's also differences across where, which geographies might be impacted. Temporal dimensions like whether future generations or current generations will be impacted. All of this means that we're talking about complex, often value-laden trade-offs, and social science has tools to help us think through and make those decisions in light of these kind of trade-offs. There's also, the potential, I think, for a lot of public backlash against this kind of thing, and we've seen that a bit already in this space. Technology, projects or technologies being delayed or kind of shut down. I would argue as well sort of classes of technology being kind of taken off the table. So in some, really, I think there's both kind of ethical, normative reasons and also pragmatic reasons to want to prioritize social science. Something that comes up when I talk to people about this is just this argument of sort of, okay, well, I get that the social science is important, but we're not ready for it yet. We need to figure out a bit more about what we're doing, how we're going to do it, where we're going to do it before it makes sense to sort of dig into the research on the social side. And I just would argue that these technical and governance decisions that are getting made now will drive and affect the kind of social impacts that we see, and also sort of how people perceive these projects and technologies. Also, just options, these options get choices get baked in, and it becomes increasingly difficult to sort of change course, pick other directions as we move forward. So I want to kind of get back to this field trial, the conversation on field trials, because I think these are really essential moments and opportunities to do social science. Part of that, I think, is because it's a lot easier to kind of engage with the public about, or just sort of broader society around a specific proposal in a discrete area, or it becomes a bit more tangible when you're talking to people, not about an idea or a concept, but rather a specific proposal. So that's kind of the entry point, I think. And maybe a first piece of this is not necessarily research, but more of a pre-research component, which is just figuring out who your affected or relevant communities might be. I think this needs to be an interdisciplinary collaboration, not just with social scientists, but with others on a research team to understand things like where are you going to source materials from, who's implicated because of that, if you're putting alkaline materials in the water, where are they going to, and who should we be talking to because of that? That's one piece. I've called this small group work. A lot of the time, this is what's referred to as kind of community engagement work, but really this means doing qualitative research with groups of people that might be considered affected communities about what they perceive to be the potential risks and benefits. They often have really context-based, localized knowledge that will inform what maybe the scientists are saying might be the risks and benefits. So that's really essential to get into and address. It's also important to talk to folks in these kind of workshops or other types of research formats about what the potential governance and political economic arrangements might be for a potential project, because that will really affect how people will view it and what they will think of it. And this gets to my last point of just this kind of work is also useful for understanding the level of interest they have in this, and really crucially, their consent to scaling up to the next, maybe a larger field trial, maybe another set of field trials. Getting back to this theme around trade-offs, I think that we have in social science a set of research methods that are kind of broadly called multi-criteria assessment. There's different types, but there are different ways to kind of integrate both expert and sort of more general public knowledge about the different kind of risks and benefits, et cetera, towards basically making evaluations of the trade-offs involved. So I think this is a way that is really important to consider as a means to not just having project decisions about project scaling up be restricted to just the sort of science research team. This is a way to make these decisions potentially be made in more inclusive and transparent ways. And the last piece is, again, kind of using the case of a potential field trial as something to engage folks around in ways that sort of generate more generalizable insights about how people in a region might view something like this. So you can do things like quantitative surveys, deliberative polls. Yeah, they tend to be more quantitative, so you can generate sort of statistically significant generalizable results. Really useful in combination with the kind of qualitative work that I also discussed. So that's sort of the things to do I would propose doing around field trials. There's also other broader research needs. One of them, I think, is building on the kind of perceptions research I just talked about and expanding that out of just Canada, the US, Europe, sort of moving that into the global south, island nations. Basically, we really have zero data on what folks in these regions think, and that's just really important that we begin to understand. I also think, when we're talking about understanding sort of where these types of approaches might be feasible, it's really essential that we move beyond just biophysical feasibility to social feasibility. So asking questions like, where are important fisheries located? Where are there where are there actually inadequate governance and risk management arrangements in place? So we don't want to work in this area because we can't guarantee, or we can't have a good chance of thinking that it will be sort of governed well. Those kind of criteria and considerations, I think, really need to be incorporated into feasibility work. And the last piece is, as we've been talking about, we're not just talking about one or two projects. The conversation here is many projects at a large scale and likely overlapping geographic regions and areas. So we really need to be thinking at a cumulative scale. And I would say shifting to that kind of a focus on what are the cumulative social impacts that might arise here. We don't have a great method or approach or a set of institutions necessarily to tackle those questions now. So I think we need to be laying the groundwork to begin answering those questions in the coming few years or so. That's what I got.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to have our final speaker before we open it up for both questions and comments, because we're also interested in hearing from all of you, so think about whether you have things you want to say. Sara Kapnick is chief scientist at NOAA, and so she's responsible for a lot of these sorts of questions. She's also worked at the intersection. She's a climate scientist, but has worked also at the intersection between climate science and finance, which is interesting, and now obviously working at the intersection between many, many aspects of climate science and policy and how government works. And we asked her to speak last because the government is going to have to do all of the things that we've heard today at some level or another. So her purview is going to cut across field trials, MRV, social science, regulatory frameworks, et cetera. So we wanted to give her a chance to sort of give us her views on the big picture. Please.
Yeah, so thank you for having me today. I'm trying to bring us home to pull it all together. So the science and policy context around MCDR is evolving quickly, and we know more about the need, the options available, and the steps needed to understand the viability. So thank you for the great science background, so I don't have to do that. And I will jump straight into, on the policy side, every piece of major climate legislation and energy legislation this year, or in the recent years, has included references to CDR. This is providing both the funding, but also the political capital critically to move all of this forward. So the White House has been very clear on the need to understand the opportunities available for CDR and has created multiple initiatives that are helping to accelerate both investments and research activities. There's acknowledgement, as with all climate action, a whole-of-government approach is required. A White House and NOAA-led fast-track action committee for marine CDR is now getting underway, the terms of reference signed this week, to start pushing forward on creating an interagency plan for marine CDR research and implementation that will address testing of promising MCDR approaches and the coordination of the necessary public-private MCDR approaches and activities. These efforts are coupled with a range of other efforts by U.S. states and cities, NGOs, academia, businesses, and other U.S. stakeholders. So what is NOAA's role? NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is under the Department of Commerce, is one of the leading agencies on marine CDR activities, given our ocean and climate expertise and infrastructure. For those of you that may not be aware, we provide 50% of the global ocean observing system, and combined with our world-class models, we are a global leader in understanding and tracking carbon sources, sinks, and fluxes. We are continuing to invest in new technologies and sensors to improve our capabilities and working with our partners around the globe to continue to increase the global coverage of our observations, our in situ observations, the physical things that are out there. We're also working on enhancing our computing capabilities and considering opportunities to leverage AI and machine learning approaches to maximize the utility of all of the observations we collect. Through that, we're also forming partnerships with the private sector to ensure that we're getting the best injections into our science. Until we've identified the core parameters necessary for verification, a ramping up of observations may be necessary, as Peter has highlighted. We also have a mandate to protect and manage marine resources and restore and conserve coastal and marine habitats, crucial for informing the planning of siting and reducing potential ecosystem impacts associated with CDR, as Sarah also mentioned. Across all of these efforts, NOAA is leveraging its ability to engage with stakeholders and communities to share and co-create the information, establish the buy-in, and facilitate transparency in this space. One of the important things to recognize about NOAA's role is we are currently technology and methodology agnostic. Our role is to provide and support the observations and research that will allow for the informed decisions about which options to pursue. As an agency under the Department of Commerce, we also have an obligation to advance innovation and support this space as a critical area for the future of the climate economy. Also, from my experience, seeing this from the market perspective as a former individual working on advancing the purchase of carbon removals around the world, from that perspective, I also see that we need different solutions, maybe the ones that are useful in different places around the world. And so we need to make sure that our agnostic stance ensures we support the promising science and technology so all of it develops. We know there are a lot of questions about MCDR approaches. In order to better understand these questions and help prioritize research needs, we have developed and released this past June a CDR research strategy. This is also our market signal that there are science and technology pathways for MCDR. If you go on that QR code, because you can't really see that table, it's very tiny, we provide a really important strategy in this, the 4 parts of it that I wanted to highlight. It gives the motivation for CDR research at NOAA. It also reviews CDR techniques and science.
That table in there is a really critical one that summarizes current understanding and relative strengths and weaknesses that we see scientifically of these various techniques. It also provides a synopsis of NOAA's key assets for CDR research. We're recognized around the world for the leadership in Earth system science and environmental stewardship, and it mandates already covers research and monitoring of Earth's carbon cycle, climate system, all the work that we already do, but also how we see new CDR techniques may need to change changes in the climate system, how it's in NOAA's work already, but then also how we see this advancing. It also provides a full vision of the future for NOAA of marine CDR research. So to summarize, our vision of MCDR really aligns with the overall NOAA mission. We want transparent and verifiable research to allow for informed decisions. We want to ensure that the research and information we are collecting is actionable and it's responsive to the growing needs that we are seeing in the scientific community and the regulatory side and into the future of being able to support this as a market and as the future of the economy. We want to build and leverage strong partnerships within and also outside of the federal government to ensure collaborative development of science and policy direction for MCDR. To meet the challenges associated with this growing industry, we suggest that the global scientific community, including NOAA, will need to proceed with multiple simultaneous streams of basic and applied research that address the effectiveness and the potential impact of carbon removal projects from a variety of efforts. The landscape is changing rapidly, and we need to be working together in order to ensure the best outcomes. The excitement is real, as you can tell from my voice and from everyone up here. But we also really need to critically avoid over-promising and under-delivering in this space. Greenwashing in the carbon markets and not delivering on expectations has created some shakiness in the market. And on marine CDR, where we are driving ahead on the science, we have an opportunity that we can really support this, support it scientifically, and ensure that this moves forward. So I also wanted to comment on how we are actually learning by doing and supporting this. Earlier this month, NOAA, on behalf of the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, we announced $24 million in funding to bring together academic researchers, federal scientists, and industry to advance research in marine carbon dioxide removal. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll be quick on this, that we brought together multiple agencies on this. We brought together National Science Foundation, DOE, and the Navy. We also brought in Climate Works from the private sector, philanthropy. So this allowed us to come together, be the science and technology lead, bring all the funding together from IRA dollars, from appropriations, from the private sector, to be able to push forward on finding some key projects that we think needed to be funded and to be able to show that this works. This includes lab experiments, modeling, field trials, and engaging communities critically to be able to understand the impacts and effectiveness of various MCDR strategies. There are also multiple co-benefits of some of the projects that we have. Like one of them is going to look at wastewater treatment as it goes into the water, and could it potentially offset changes in pH that are affecting clam production. So all of this work aligns with recommended research priorities in the NOAA research strategy, and it allows us to learn by doing and understand what the barriers to further access to this is, and critically support new technologies that we may need in the future. So what's next? The interest and demand for CDR and MCDR specifically, it's not going to go away, it's only going to increase. This increase also means that approaches being pursued are potentially higher risk or in less certain environments like the deep ocean. As a global community, we need to find the balance between inspired creativity and tangibly delivering the results that we need. We can do this if the project objectives and expected outcomes are clear, there are strong and replicable monitoring, reporting, and verification standards. We embrace learning by doing. We try to match dollars for action with dollars for science, and we spend time building community trust, communications, and partnerships. In conclusion, NOAA and our interagency partners are leaning in on MCDR. We are advancing scientific thinking about the regulatory issues and trying to create the enabling conditions for both science as well as markets for this to realize the potential climate outcomes that we need. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for bearing with us through all of this. Thanks to all the speakers for the insightful comments. Now it's time to hear from you, if you'd like. We are open to having some questions and or comments. If there are comments, please keep them brief and not promotional. There's a couple of mics right here, and this is being recorded for other audiences, so it'd be great if you could actually speak into the mic. And maybe I'll take a few questions in a row before seeing who's going to answer them. So please, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. My question is about what role do you feel marine CDR has in protecting our current blue carbon resources, specifically mangroves, just all the wonderful ecosystems that we already have that are doing so much to, protect our planet and that are really threatened.
Thank you for that. Next, Craig.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for this forum. This is particularly insightful. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, and I know that as a federal employee, it would be difficult for Sara to offer a comment on this, but as we've seen a kludging together or bundling together of $24 million of all the federal agencies, meanwhile, our neighbors to the north, Canada, has 10 times that amount, excuse me, appropriated for a similar amount of time. Does Canada think this is more important than the United States? Rhetorical question, perhaps. But I want to go to Romany's paper and model legislation that points out that until you appoint a single federal agency in charge, you have this limiting factor of the coalition of the willing rather than purposeful instruction. So I would enjoy some comments on that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Yes.
So you briefly mentioned that AI can play an important role in this, and so I was just wondering, from the perspective of a software engineer, exactly how you see this coming into play in a useful way that doesn't introduce more complications, especially since AI is also a field that legislation is falling behind a bit.
Great. All right, why don't we pause just for a sec, because otherwise I'm going to lose track of this. So the first question was about blue carbon ecosystems as one of the various domains of marine CDR, and also the interactions between other domains of marine CDR and blue carbon ecosystems. I don't know if anybody wants to take a cut at that.
I mean, so I've been here all week for Climate Week, and one of the many UN meetings I attended was actually considering ocean-based climate solutions. That a big part of the component of this was the conservation of mangroves and blue carbon solutions, and together with about 5 or 6 other interventions, could represent something like 35 to 48%, I think it was, of the carbon dioxide reductions that we need to have in hand by 2050. And so it's just to underscore your point, the tremendous importance of conserving those natural assets that we have that today sequester carbon, not to perturb them, to preserve them, conserve them, and also to expand them. So that was actually something that was brought up explicitly on an international forum.
I just wanted to say, in addition to the significant carbon benefits that these ecosystems have, they also have a lot of other benefits for coastal communities in particular. And so that's another reason just why it's so important to protect and improve them. The other thing I just wanted to say was about someone, I think it was Dr. Kapnick, mentioned the potential for co-benefits in this space. And we should be really, I think, thinking about these interactions. Like, we know that we have a climate crisis, and we want to explore these approaches as a possible means of combating that climate crisis. But we shouldn't forget the other impacts that they might have, both negative and positive, and the potential for some of these approaches to sort of support the broader blue economy that we are starting to see develop, and in particular around some of the climate solutions, ocean climate solutions.
So just one sec, Sarah. I just wanted to say that I showed a slide of these roadmaps that we've done on ocean CDR technologies. There was 4 of them up there at that time: microalgae, macroalgae, electrochemistry, and alkalinity. There is a 5th that is in process, and will be up there soon, on what we call living blue carbon, and it looks at all of the potential contributions of blue carbon ecosystems and populations, right? So now we're talking about fish populations and marine mammals, and so that, that completes what we think is the full set of possible approaches for blue carbon. I want to see if we can pivot to this other question about, but you can answer both, about a lead federal designated agency as being critical to being able to move this versus a whole of government approach, and your thoughts on that.
I'm going to answer the one I wanted to answer first.
You can answer that one first.
So on mangrove projects, it's interesting. Those are actually the most viable in the carbon markets today, mangrove projects in the marine environment, partially just because you can also see the mangroves and see the development, and so the techniques for knowing how much carbon is in there it's more verifiable and continuously verifiable via satellite data and other information. And so it's a critical part of all of this is making sure that we have, verification, we support it and support it around the world. And I see that as an area of the carbon market that will continue from what we've heard. And the co-benefit piece, it's not necessarily in the carbon prices what the co-benefits are, but they're often attached to them and assigned to them. And we see this, so there's interest in this and all the social impacts, the marine biodiversity, the nature impacts, and we see some overlap as we're also having biodiversity and nature capital development and needs for scientific information in that space too. And so as a result, as projects are happening in the conservation space relating to blue carbon, we're seeing it pop up. So an example I wanted to give, we put $562 million towards coastal resilience. And some of those projects are wetland restoration, mangrove restoration, seagrass restoration. Some of those projects within them, talking to the project developers or groups, they are getting the funding to do these restoration efforts and to build coastal resilience. We're giving the funding for that. They're then also trying to monetize the carbon benefits of those projects, as well as figuring out how to have access to the budding, emerging nature capital biodiversity market. And so we need to have the science to show what the carbon piece is, and we may be funding projects that are coastal resilience or others that are then able to actually make it more viable long-term economically by adding in these other factors. And then on your second question, we have this fast action group of creating our priorities going forward, and we are trying to be a strong voice in all of this, but we are banding together because there are different equities and research and work that all of us bring to the table.
Yeah. Just, I'll make one more comment on that. As Ocean Visions, having a clear statement of federal interest in a topic or of any national government interest is really important. And even though the IPCC has made clear that carbon removal is absolutely critical, there are very few countries that have carbon removal plans as part of their climate action plan, right? It's only barely starting to make it into the NDC process. That needs to change. The UNFCCC and at these COPs needs to start having very focused discussions about how are we going to achieve the 100 to 1,000 gigatons of carbon removal that is being called for by our scientific body. And so we need to try and see that throughout government. I want to ask Antonius about AI. So I put that out there. I don't have an answer. I just have a very strong idea that AI could possibly help, and so could synthetic biology and all these other fields that aren't in our design of these technologies, but you're closer to this.
Yeah, let me also try to think about a question that you then will have to answer, that you have no idea about. So one of the things that we haven't mentioned really today is models, and in the context of MRV, which is the quantification of whether ocean CDR actually leads to CDR, there is a growing recognition that sensors alone will not be the solution. And so there needs to be a very integrated approach to calibrating models in such a way that they provide the confidence on quantification that we need for the trust of markets and the trust of society. And that model development is extremely expensive. And part of why it is expensive is that the ocean is divided up into parcels, and within each parcel there is a calculation happening that is informed by the neighboring parcel and so on. And this is not my field, but all I know is when I get proposals from people working on models, and I flip down to the cost section, the computing cost is just insane, and so the hope is, and I don't know the first thing about AI or machine learning, the hope is that there might be ways to innovate on modeling in the ocean space to get to faster, less computationally heavy, cheaper solutions for MRV. There's a group represented here, Seaworthy, who has put much more thought into that than any of us has. So that might be my, handing over this question to somebody else here.
And Peter wanted to have a crack at it too.
Yeah, just a quick thing. So I too don't even play an AI specialist on TV. I'm just, I know some people. But actually it does play a big role in our robotics program. One of the real breakthroughs in robotics, at least at the Woods Hole Oceanographic, has been actually the use of onboard computing on using an NVIDIA chip that's like the fastest chip you can use, so it's the smartest robot that exists. And basically what the vehicle can do is it can do onboard decision making to intelligently sample a volume of ocean. So for example, if it were scanning this room, it can actually, we've actually coded curiosity into it, so it can actually go into a naive environment and learn about the space and actually build awareness about the space. And so one example is that if you wanted to follow an ISO line of pH or an ISO line of chlorophyll or whatever it is that you're trying to track, this vehicle can do that and more, and it can actually tell other vehicles to join it in that journey and actually measure gradients either orthogonal to them or a long line. So these are all things that are totally within the realm of possibility now, in part because we can couple onboard machine learning with ability to process it in real time as you're making your measurements.
So let's take a couple more questions. I just want to make one more comment about the mashup of different disciplines, because this is more of an intuition and also not even an intuition. It's basically looking at what's happened in other fields. There's always the intersection of diverse technologies that iterate upon things to create new innovation. And in the ocean CDR technology space, that hasn't happened very intentionally. It does happen without a doubt, but we haven't invited people like the woman who asked the question for you to answer that question. How do you think AI, if Antonius describes some of the CDR technologies working in, how do you think AI could help? Or how do you think AI could help on the MRV challenges or the social science research? So instead of you asking us, we need to ask you, and we need to create forums where people with those expertise can come and sit with us and really think about those applications. So a few more questions. Yes.
Hi, Holly Buck. So the visual setup of this panel was kind of interesting because first you have the men on one side talking about the science, and then the women talking about what would be needed to responsibly facilitate some of these concepts. And it tends to be that work is relational and gendered and undervalued. And I'm thinking about how the bipartisan infrastructure law is spending $12 billion on carbon management, and a lot of that will be wasted if those projects don't go through because people in the world don't understand why we would need carbon management, and they're not interested in hosting it necessarily. And now we have on the table new legislation, $12 billion, again this time for carbon dioxide removal research. But if you look, you'll get to page 96 out of 97, and there's a couple $1 million for social science. And are we just like repeating the same mistakes? So to pivot this comment into a question, I'm curious to hear from people on the panel, what percentage of funding, either from the government or from philanthropy, do you think should be devoted to the social considerations and engagement around these technologies?
Thank you. let's just take a couple more, and then we'll parcel them out.
Yeah, my question is a complement to that, actually. So you've rightly highlighted that understanding the co-benefits of this effort for local communities is very important for social license in particular. So I'd be curious to hear maybe concrete examples of potential co-benefits beyond the restoration of mangroves or ecosystems. Those, I think, are the obvious ones. But I think, I have a harder time imagining co-benefits from alkalinity enhancement or microalgae, for example. So I'd be curious if you have already some concrete examples you could share.
Great. Yes, please. We'll take both of these. Then.
Thanks. My name is Ben. I am sort of an M&V engineer in the energy efficiency space, but my question has little to do with that. My question is around funding and economics of this space in general. It's cool to see things like large-scale DAC being funded privately by the private sector in sort of a philanthropic way. It's also with something like CDR, which has such clear societal benefit, natural for it to be governmentally funded. But then there was also that slide at the beginning of this presentation about venture funding. I'm curious which parts of MCDR are commercially viable from a startup perspective, which parts are receiving that sort of more large-scale industrial grants or donations, and then sort of in addition to the government stuff, like where can money come from and which parts of the technology are viable for that and how we can get there.
Okay, thank you. One more before I lose track of this.
Thank you. I think he beat me to it, but I'm Sara Rosner. I'm from Alliance Bernstein. We have membership with the Columbia Climate School, and we're an investment manager here in the United States. I guess I would also open up the question to ask how the panelists are thinking about the role of financial services in this work, and what kind of engagement you're thinking about, or what would be useful. We mostly invest in publicly listed equities and fixed income, as well as some private and alternatives businesses. But yeah, we would love to hear more about how to get more involved. Thanks.
Great. Okay, some interesting and challenging questions. Does anybody have a thought on the first one about sort of the relative investment importance, or in percentages? I think was Holly's specific number about how much should go to social versus physical or technical or science. I mean, I'm not really sure what the breakdown is. It's potentially hard to just pull that number out of the air, but.
Yeah, thanks, Holly, for the excellent points and tough question. Certainly, I completely agree. So I completely agree that we need more, and I'm not quite sure what that exact amount is, but it's certainly orders of magnitude more than what we're seeing now. I think another piece that maybe I can comment on is just the need for more social science expertise as well. It doesn't feel like there's sufficient there, and that to me feels like a parallel challenge to also be thinking about how we kind of get folks to be taking up this work, and yeah, in addition to the funding, which is very real, very real, yeah.
Sarah, do you have a thought?
I agree with everything she said. And then on top of it, like with our IRA funding, something new that we did was we actually created projects within it for our chief economist to oversee impact analysis of that funding, because I am of the perspective, particularly on adaptation needs for coastal resilience, climate area fisheries, marine CDR, all of this work. Just the financial obligation of the future to fund these things is just going to continue to grow, and we did write that in the economic report to the president last March. There's an entire chapter about climate adaptation, funding resilience, and the needs for this type of work. So for efficient investments going forward, we need the social science impacts to be able to understand the whole of society impacts of these activities, to be able to make sure that we are prioritizing them effectively with our dollars that we have.
Sorry,
Yes,
Ben.
please.
I mean, I think Colleen makes a good point, and even about the setup of the panel, which was my bad, but unintentional. But I think it's not just about funding, right? It's about how to, the funding piece is important, and we certainly do need more funding for the social science research, but it's also about how to effectively integrate that work with the other work that's happening. And what I tend to see when I speak to people in this space or contribute to projects in this space, even if it's framed as an interdisciplinary endeavor or a multidisciplinary endeavor, the work is very siloed and the connections between them are often not there. And so I think there really needs to be an effort to break those silos down and to more fully integrate the work. And I think there's lots of different ways to do that. As someone who works in a university, I think about how the way that we teach people who are going to end up working in this field can influence that and can help to break down some of these barriers. The folks who are working on the sort of hard science, quote unquote, doing the MRV and the oceanography and all the things that feed into that, also need to understand the ethics and the governance and the social pieces of this. And so there's it's a huge challenge, but it's also an opportunity, I think.
So I'll just add one comment. I mean, I think our experience with COVID and our COVID response is a great example of a fairly epic fail on social science, right? We spent enormous amounts of money on the science, the hard science of creating a vaccine and creating new testing equipment and new preventive equipment, and yet very little on actually figuring out what would be the barriers for use. And so now we have this really hardened and entrenched backlash. And so, it's just an example of where you really have to be thinking about these things in an integrated way right from the beginning. I want to pivot to the question now about finance. So I'll come back to the co-benefits, although co-products is part of that. But so Peter, you said very clearly this can't be led by the private sector in your comments. Yet the private sector actually is leading in many ways in this space. There's at least 40 ocean CDR startups, and there's a number of startups in MRV. And so there's clearly, and there are voluntary carbon markets, so there's clearly a role for the market, but we all recognize that it also can't be necessarily led by the market. So how do we navigate that and give people who want to play a role an opportunity to play that role without skewing this to a place where there'll be a backlash? Maybe.
Yeah, I'll just offer some perspective from my experience. So actually, it's interesting with AB. I was working with you when I was at Columbia, and I realized then, as I realize now, the tremendous power that the private sector can bring to a problem when they decide to lean into it with purpose. And where we are right now, I think, with MCDRs, it's so much in its infancy that any such investments are going to be very risky, and they are. And so a big part of what we're doing at the Oceanographic, but it's also with Blue Ocean as well over in France, is we established something called Propeller, which is a venture fund. It's actually a hybrid venture fund that focuses on ocean-based climate solutions. But the approach that they're taking is novel in that what they're working to do is to accelerate the intellectual property that then can inform some of these solutions, because a lot of what we're trying to do is really at the cutting, bleeding edge of either technology or knowledge or computing or modeling, and so it's really inviting this kind of new wave of innovation. Another thing that's happening from it is actually there's a spin-off such that it actually invests in incubation of new ideas within the Oceanographic, in our case, for our scientists to basically have the catalytic capital to go after problems that are really hairy and difficult and risky, the kind of thing that federal agencies generally wouldn't fund. But when you fast forward a couple of years, it's suddenly you're on the other side of solving a problem. And then it gets interesting for the private sector. And this is, what we're seeing is there are opportunities for some of these things to make their way into either corporate America or just in the sort of general world. And you know, this is one of the things I'm sort of most excited about, is I think this is such an invitation for really exploring this new frontier. And if I can, I'm going to like bridge, if you will, to the co-benefits, because the co-benefit here is that, you know, somebody asked me once, what's the best case scenario and what's the worst case scenario if you do this? Do this meaning everything we've been talking about today. And I'll start with the worst case scenario. I mean, assuming we all do it ethically, we follow the code of conduct, we do this, you know, the best we can, but the worst case scenario would be like, actually none of these things work. And going back to the title of the talk, you know, none of them work, none of them scale, none of them are safe. But now we've got these new eyes on 70% of the planet. We have this new vital sign sensing capability for the entire depth of the planet, the lungs of the planet, the life of the planet. Something where we're flying blind right now. So the co-benefit there is, you know, we can track clay plumes coming off of deep sea mining. You know, we're not paying any attention to the negative impacts of that industry. We just, because we don't have the capability. Same thing for offshore wind, for fisheries, and you can go on and on. Think about, what if we had eyes on the ocean like we have on the atmosphere? Just imagine the kind of insight we're going to get there just from basic scientific knowledge, but also how it applies to these really big things that we're doing in the ocean today, while the ocean's in transition. So that's the kind of worst case scenario, which to me is pretty good. And then the best case scenario is that we actually solve this damn problem.
Yes, you want to comment on the role of the private sector in this?
Yeah, we were very careful in thinking about this too, and how we were funding through IRA funding and working cross-government on it. And one of the things we did was work with U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, which is a sister agency in Commerce. So there's actually also a fast-tracking process now that anyone in the space should be aware of. It's called Patents for Climate Mitigation. Through next year, it fast-tracks the patent process, lower cost also to patent, to under 12 months. And the idea with that, too, was that if we're going to put all this money into the innovation, we need to make sure that it's supported through the IP process, and because then that also improves access to capital to those early-stage companies. Related to it, too, we structured that $24 million based on multiple dialogues that we also have with the private sector and venture capital community around where are the gaps in MRV that they're seeing in all the companies that they're being pitched. And it was the sensor technology. And we also, from our scientific background, are saying we also need this. And so it was the space where we knew we needed to fund the earlier stage research to ensure that we have those technologies. Then we partnered with ARPA-E also in discussions and gave that shared science and knowledge of everything else, because they, at a further level in commercialization, they're beyond the science and technology fundamental development. They're on the commercialization side. They actually have a parallel program for those more advanced technologies in the sensor space that already exist. And so we did that on that tiered process. Related to this too, Department of Energy recently announced a $100 million grant program for carbon removal offsets and projects. And with that, again, there are going to be multiple different types of projects hopefully in there, and some of them may be MCDR if they are developed fully enough for blue carbon. But it's a matter of trying to also create that market signal then with $100 million around that as well. Additionally, there's then another gap from the early stage science and technology development into that commercialization space in the Valley of Death that we've also funded $60 million for accelerator programs in ocean technologies, and we just received all the grants on that, and some of them are in the carbon space as well. And so we need to be able to fund this at all levels of the innovation so the science and technology can scale from the government research labs and academia into the private sector and fully grow. And so we see this as a critical piece of making all of this advance, because we don't have enough funding alone to be able to make sure that we both fund all of this, but then also that it scales into the private sector and the markets.
Great. Did you want to add something, Antonius?
I think I just wanted to add to what Sarah was just saying. There's this progression, right, of high risk capital to project finance, and the approach of getting there just from a financial perspective is to progressively de-risk these technologies, right? And in order to de-risk them from a government perspective, from a philanthropic perspective, you have to understand the risk perception of the next, pocket of money. And these conversations, I think, are not happening enough. Really glad to hear Sarah talk about these coordinations happening. But that is absolutely necessary as a next step.
Awesome. The only thing I would add to that issue of the role of the private sector is as soon as we get a global carbon market that is more than voluntary, which we have to have if we're going to solve this enormous carbon management problem that we face, it's going to change the dynamics of this a lot, right? Because then you're going to have a lot of capital looking for the lowest cost provision of durable, safe, and verifiable carbon. And the race will be on. And I think there's already a lot of people thinking about that now in anticipation of a compliance carbon markets growing around the world, which has to happen for us to solve this problem. If this is purely a public cleanup process, the largest public cleanup process in history, we are much less likely to succeed than if there's a market built around it.
Co-benefits.
Yes. Right. Right. So one thing in the maps that we've produced, there are environmental and social benefits elements that are highlighted there. So, just an example, there's an experiment going on in Northwest Washington right now on alkalinity that it could potentially be quite favorable to shellfish growers, right? Because increasing acidity in areas of the Puget Sound is impacting shellfish operations, and so alkalinity can potentially help reverse that. It's just one example, but there's many examples. Large seaweed cultivation there's lots of byproducts and co-products that can be extracted from that before bundling the biomass for carbon sequestration. And so I think there's a long list, but it's clearly part of what the technologies have to do as they look to move forward is be able to identify those co-benefits and co-products and really maximize them, because the economics are unlikely to work otherwise also, or the social aspects. But I'm conscious that we promised an hour of networking and bagels and coffee, and I think we can have a more robust conversation if we repair to that. So again, thank you for coming. Thanks to all of you for providing your expertise and your time this morning. We give a round of applause to the panel. And please, let's have some coffee and bagels and talk.